suboptimal solution. There's a twist there that's going to follow you up. Now, it may be the best that you've got. Sometimes that happens. I'm not saying that you can always solve a problem in an optimal manner. Do you remember the movie Sophie's Choice? Did you ever see that? It's an old movie. Sophie, it's a movie about Germany during the Nazi period. She had to choose which of her two children was going to be shot. Well, it's pretty hard to come up with an optimal solution to that problem, right? So Rogers, though, didn't really think that actual problems in life constituted psychopathology. That's sort of more the existentialist, although he had an existential twist. He was thinking more that what constituted psychopathology, per se, instead of just plain ordinary suffering, was the contradictions that arose because people failed to use their potential for articulation in a manner that continually fostered their integration. So he would say, well, to the degree that you were going to use instrumental language, it's not a term he used, but it's a good summary of his philosophy, that you were bringing to bear on yourself and others around you unnecessary pain and suffering. And that was psychopathological. It's psychopathological because it's unnecessary, because in principle it could be avoided. So that's the idea. And so the idea as well is that the organizing principle that brings you into this optimally functioning hierarchy is your commitment to truth, to accurately represent what it is that you experience. And that's, again, how Piaget talked about the fundamental truth as a process rather than as a state or a fact. It's the case for Rogerian phenomenology as well, and you can kind of understand that because, of course, therapists are dealing with people, living people, and life is a process, not a state. And so Rogers was concentrating very much on the process, which he regarded as absolutely crucial, and believed that the process properly implemented, would bring about the best possible organization, and then would update that organization as necessary too. So it's a radical idea, but I would also say that it's fundamentally rooted in his Protestant Christianity, because one of the tenets of Christianity is that the word orders chaos. And so that idea was lurking at the bottom of Rogers' conceptual structure, and he was intelligent enough to articulate it fully in a modern way, but that's still where it came from. Now, it's an older idea of Christianity, so. Now, Rogers also believed some other things, and this is where I think he gets a little bit optimistic, but he's no fool, so Rogers is one of those optimists you really have to contend with. Now, he believed, and I think this is a classical Protestant belief as well, that what evil was basically the absence of good, and that people had a strong intrinsic impulse towards the good that you could help them realize, and the way you helped them realize that was by setting the preconditions for the emergence of that good. And he believed that the preconditions were the provision of a space for communication where there was no judgment in the sense of rejection. And so here's the Rogerian theory with regards to therapeutic endeavor. Now, the first thing is, and this seems critical, and I think Rogers was right about this, that the client has to want to change. And this is a funny thing about therapy, because my observation has been that it's not something you can impose on people. Unless they've decided that things could be better, and that alterations in something they're doing might make it better, it's a non-starter. And so I've had clients who were court-ordered to attend therapy, and that's just a complete waste of time, especially if they're more on the psychopathic end of things, because if they don't want to change, they're not going to learn. And this is actually another Rogerian principle, and because Rogers had an educational philosophy as well, and the educational philosophy was students will not learn things that are not relevant to them. And so one of the teacher's duties was to make the material at hand relevant, because that would help the student remember it. Why remember it if it's not relevant? It's one of the things I try to do in my lectures. I try to tell people when I'm lecturing why they should know this, and the fundamental answer always, if you push it down far enough, is that if you know this, your life will go better, and so will the life of people around you. So you should listen, because then there's some things that are sharp and pointy that you won't run into while you're wandering around in the fog. So, and that's the fundamental issue. It's necessary to know these things. And so if you're dealing with someone who hasn't decided that there's something wrong and that they have something to do about it, and that maybe they could change and that would make things better, you're not going anywhere. And Rogers would also say that's actually a precondition for a relationship, period. Because he didn't really make much of a distinction between a therapeutic relationship and a genuine relationship, because he thought that genuine relationships were therapeutic. And so one of the principles that you can extract from that is that if you're in a relationship, one useful proposition is that, well, you're pretty perfect, but you're probably not quite as perfect as you could be. And so it's possible that your partner, no matter how deeply flawed they are, might now and then have something to say to you that would, if you incorporated, would bring you to an even higher state of perfection, right? And so that means you have to listen. And it's worse than that. And this, again, is a Rogerian observation. You might have to help them criticize you, because maybe they're not very good at it. And so there's something they're trying to tell you in their stumbly way, and it's an actual thing, but they can't articulate it. And so it'd be easy for you, just to, especially if you're trying to use language instrumentally and to get away with it, just to, well, you can even make fun of the way they're poorly articulating the problem. That's a really good one, because then you can convince them not to do such things in the future. But if you take the other stance, which is, well, I've got some things to learn, and you've got some things to learn, and you've got some things to teach me, and I've got some things to teach you, and God only knows when that's going to happen, but it might happen. So the object of the conversation is for each person to help the other person make their point. And that's a lot different than winning the argument. And I can tell you one thing: you will not win an argument with any intimate partner ever. Because you're not playing the game of the argument, you're playing the game of iterated arguments across time. And so if you win an argument, you just set up another one. Winning and solving the problem aren't the same thing. So from a Rogerian perspective, winning would be the maintenance of your current self-structure at the cost of failure to integrate some disintegrated element of the phenomenological realm. Maybe it'd be the unhappiness of your partner. That might be one of them. Now, if you win the argument, that's the rationalization issue fundamentally. You don't have to change, but the fact is you do have to change, because the way you are is giving rise to this situation, and that's not going to change unless you fix it. So winning an argument and fixing something, those are completely different things. You fix the thing, it goes away. And often, couples have to have conflict, because there's no difference between conflict and thinking. Thinking is a form of war. It's just that you make it an interior form of war, right? You can't have a couple without conflict, because life is different, difficult, and people differ from one another. So they have different value structures. And so you can't just ignore that. You have to set up a dialogue because it's not necessarily obvious who's right. Of course, Rogers believed that in the therapeutic realm too. So he thought of therapy as something that emerged as a consequence of the adoption of certain axiomatic presuppositions, and those were things could be better than they are, and you could make them that way, and that's also true for me. And then the next presumption is, well, maybe we can figure out how to do that in a with collaborative communication. So Rogers believed that the therapist was just as transformed during the therapeutic process as the person. In fact, if that wasn't happening, then whatever was happening wasn't the kind of healing therapy that Rogers would like to have happen. And he also said that's, I'll read you something he said later, but he also pointed out quite strongly that that's why people don't really like to listen. You know, like maybe there's some flaw in your cell structure at some fundamental level, fundamentally axiomatic level. You know, maybe you're narcissistic, that'd be a good one. And you know, if you listen to people, they're going to tell you you're narcissistic. Well, you don't want to find that out because it's going to blow a huge hole in your, blow a huge hole in your cell structure. That's not very fun. But hypothetically, that beats running into the obstacles that you will run into if you're narcissistic repeatedly as you move forward through life. So you can either live with your flaws or correct them. That's and the pathway to correction is dialogue, communication. So now the next part of the Rogerian therapeutic trap. Yes, yes.
What's the difference between genuine criticism of someone, or genuinely giving your perspective, or just arguing a point?
Well, that's a good question. Let's see if we can formulate that. So the first difference might be, well, what's the outcome we're looking for? Like, let's think about that. Let's think about that in the context of an intimate relationship, a familial relationship. So you have a wife, let's say, and you've got some kids. What are you up to? What do you want?
Hopefully trying to make things better.
Okay, so that's one thing. We're trying to establish the domain of the argument. We're going to try and make things better. What would better look like, do you think?
No. In the short term, I use to try to eliminate whatever negative emotion I'm feeling.
Okay, so there's something, okay, so that's a Rogerian presupposition, is that part of what you're doing when you're making things better is to decrease the probability that negative emotion will arise. Short term or long term?
Short term first. That's what's bothering me.
Ah, okay, so that's an interesting thing, because what if you have to experience a tremendous amount of short-term pain in order to make long-term progress?
If it's different from the pain that initially got me thinking about it, that seems like improvement, potentially.
Okay.
Going somewhere.
Okay, well, I'm going to address your question completely from a Piagetian perspective, but that's okay, because it works for Rogers as well. It's just easier to explain. Freedom from unnecessary suffering, in the short, medium, and long term, across as many people as you can manage. So we'll say you can start with you and your family. Okay, how are you going to do that? You don't know. That's what you have to talk about. But you can't have that conversation until you've got that framework, right? So, and it's very, very tricky, because in the midst of the argument, there's going to be tremendous temptation to oppress and deceive and humiliate and treat with contempt and hurt and punish and threaten, all of those things, right? And that's partly reactivity in the short term. And then that's not properly integrated into the overarching hierarchical structure. So you've got to keep bringing yourself back to that. It's like, well, why should you control your impulses? Well, because they're manifestation in the present. They're spontaneous and impulsive manifestation in the present. Well, although that may be it may carry with it a feeling of freedom and power, maybe destroying the very structure that's going to provide you with peace and stability over the medium and long run. So it's the idea of contradiction. Now, if we're having a discussion, okay, so let's say, we'll do this in a very local fashion. It's like, let's say you're having a discussion with your partner about who's going to cook dinner. Okay, so you think that's a simple discussion. It's like, it's not a simple discussion, it's a horrible discussion. It's where the war between the genders manifests itself. It's one of the places. And to solve it, weirdly enough, you actually have to solve the war between the genders. Well, good luck with that. And there it is right in your house, right? It's like a snake in the garden. There's no getting rid of it. Okay, so then you might think, well, what's our aim for dinner? Well, do we want to have wretched, miserable, rotten food served by a resentful person to a bunch of ungrateful rats who complain and snivel? It's like, no, let's assume we don't want that. Okay, good, well, we know what we're not aiming at. It's like, all right, who should cook dinner and when, and what are the rules by which we decide that? Huh, that's a tough one, because you can return to roles, right? That's why people have roles, so they don't have to have stupid conversations like this, but that time is gone. Okay, so what do you do when there's no role? Well, I can make you do it, maybe. You know, I could either do it physically by force, or I could just intimidate you, or I could make life miserable for you if you don't do it, or, you know, there's lots of ways of using power. Problem with that is, you're not without your own weapons. And for every step I take towards making you miserable, you'll get your chance. So probably we don't want to use force. Plus, that's not so good for the kids, you know, from a role model perspective, and hypothetically we want good things to be happening to them. So tyranny looks like it's out, and I don't want you to subjugate yourself, because maybe you're very agreeable.
Shop Lamps Plus now, up to 50% off during the half-price days and sale.
Let's say that, because that's often a problem in communication between men and women. The guy's more disagreeable than the woman is, and so if he jacks up the level of conflict, she'll back off because she doesn't like conflict for all sorts of different reasons. So that's another way of winning, except then the person who loses is all resentful, and you end up with, you know, horrible, miserable food, fed to warring partners who are complaining and struggling. It's not a good solution. All right, so then what are you left with? Well, then you've got negotiation. Okay, so I might say, well, do we agree that we need to have dinner? Well, you know, we might think, okay, well, we could agree on that. How often should we have it at home? Well, that's going to require a fair bit of thought. You want to go out now and then? How often? How much is that going to cost? What are we going to spend? Where are we going to go? Okay, who pays? Okay, so that's going to be like a whole conversation. So let's say we figure that out. It's like 5 days a week we're going to stay home. Okay, who's going to cook? Well, do you like cooking? Do I like cooking? That's something to sort out. So that's like a little discussion with your own physiology in some sense. You know, what's your felt state while you're preparing food? And maybe you'll say, well, I like it. I'll cook if there's someone in the kitchen with me, and you know, someone else cleans up afterwards. Then it turns out that I don't mind cooking. Well, then you might say, well, is not minding good enough, or do you really want to enjoy it? It's like, what's the preconditions? What preconditions would have to be met for you to enjoy it? Well, you want to think about that, because if you can get the person, either of you, who the hell cares, to enjoy it, then it's sort of self-sustaining, right? You put that into place, and then the thing runs smoothly across multiple iterations. And so then you might think, well, what are the preconditions for us to do that in a way that would be joyful, let's say? Okay, well, that's a high bar. It's like, well, one or the other of us should learn to cook, because otherwise we're going to be eating, like, canned spaghetti or some other sort of horror, and that's not very high quality, so that problem might have to be solved. And then there's the problem of how you react to the person when they cook. Like, do you just assume that that's their bloody responsibility, and if they don't live up to it, there's something wrong with them? Or do you notice what they're doing and express some appreciation and gratitude, and in a way that would increase the probability that it would happen again? That'd be a better solution, so then you have to negotiate about how you're going to do that, exactly. Maybe even right down to the level of words. But what you're trying to serve a higher order by doing that, right? You're trying to satisfy basic organismal needs. The provision of food, but I mean, food's complicated for human beings, because you just don't pour dog food in the bowl and chow down. Even dogs won't do that. Our dog won't eat unless we're eating. So human beings are extremely social eaters. So you have to get that right. And so, but the conversation will only take place in the proper manner if your orientation is proper during the conversation. And the orientation needs to be, how can we make this better for both of us in the long run and for the people around us? And that you have to bow down before that in some sense as the highest order principle that you're serving. And then you can stumble around trying to work that out. And then you might say, well, you cook 3 times a week and I cook twice and I'll take you out once. And then, of course, you have to get the whole grocery thing settled out, and that's a whole other bloody complicated conversation, but it needs to be done. And then you might say, well, let's run this for a couple of weeks, and we'll see how it goes, and then we can meet again, and we can discuss what worked and what didn't. And the goal is to make it better, make it better, make it better, make it better. And then no one's trying to win. Well, it depends on what you mean by win. I'm not trying to defeat you. Why? Well, I have to live with you. That'd be the first reason. It's like, what the hell good is it defeating you unless I want someone wandering around like this, resentful and bitter. Maybe I do want that. But I don't think that's a very good place to start. So, when you have a client come in to see you, the rule is, I can tell you the rules I use because they're Rogerian. I will tell the person what I think. So I won't tell them that what I think is right. But if they're doing something and I have a reaction to that of some sort, that'll usually express itself in a fantasy or thought, and I'll just tell them what happened. And I try to do it as gently as I possibly can, because you can use the truth as a club, but then that's not the truth. And then at least they get the honest response of one person to what they're like. And I'll tell you, I've seen lots of people who've never got the honest response of any one person ever in their whole life to what they're like. And so they have no idea what they're like, or what's annoying other people, or how they should behave, or any of those things. So even though I'm not going to be right, in that my reactions won't be a precisely accurate representation of the average response of other people, which is basically what you're trying to model, it's going to be a lot better than they've had so far. And then another precondition is, you're going to try really hard to get yourself together, whatever that means. We're going to talk about whatever that means, and I'm going to support you in that. And that's our goal. And that's a variant of Rogerian unconditional positive regard. And his unconditional positive regard, in some sense, was the setup for the therapy. So the presupposition is, you're valuable, although maybe you're a little on the bent and twisted side, but maybe you could be straightened up into something that's like deadly. And we're going to start with that presupposition, and we're going to learn on the way. But that's what we're aimed at. So the unconditional positive regard, it's like a human rights thing, because the basis of the idea of human rights is that people are valuable. They have some intrinsic value. And I think maybe it's reasonable to presuppose that from the Rogerian perspective is that what's valuable about you is your being, right? You're a locus of experience. And as such, you're a unique locus of experience, and as such, you have something to contribute that no one else can contribute. And that's valuable. It's intrinsically valuable. That's the basic presupposition of the idea of human rights, by the way. So if that's acted out in the therapeutic session, but it's acted out in any relationship that's therapeutic. Here's a counterexample. Let's say you're trying to smoke, trying to quit smoking. You're trying to quit smoking, okay? And your friends smoke, okay? So what are they doing? Like, do they offer you a cigarette at every possible opportunity? Because that's very common. People do that very commonly. Why? Well, maybe they're mad that they can't quit smoking, or maybe if you quit and they didn't, that would cast them in a bad shadow, or maybe they're just being malevolent, or maybe it's a game, or whatever. But one of the things it isn't is in the best interest of the person who's trying to quit smoking, or drinking, or eating, or behaving in any sort of dismal manner that's self-defeating across time. And so one of the things that, I had a client just a while back, and he was talking about an older sibling, and he used to make these models, very complicated models. He was quite young at this time. His sibling was like a decade and a half older, so he was like 10 or something like that. He'd make these really complex models. He'd spend a couple of weeks building them, and then when the older sibling came in, he'd just smash them up. It's like, well, let's see what kind of stress this thing can take. It's like, okay, what's going on there? Well, I wouldn't say it's unconditional positive regard with the aim of encouraging the person and bringing them to fruition. It's quite the opposite. And it's an instrumental use of action. And the point is not to elevate me or you or both of us. The point is, I'm going to be the monster at the top of the hierarchy. If you're all crunched up and lying at the bottom, that's just fine. And that's a very common set of motivations. And you might ask, well, why isn't that okay? Well, that's a good question. I think the right answer to that is, as a long-run game, it's counterproductive. No one benefits. So there's local benefits to you in the short term. So, all right. Let me read you some things that Rogers wrote. Okay, this is a good one. This is a good one, because this is his statements. Here's some of his axiomatic presuppositions. So this is what you need to cleave to if you're going to engage in the process of Rogerian therapy. You have to want to be independent. Now that's an interesting, I don't know, maybe we can actually have a discussion about this. Freud thought the Oedipal complex was universal. And what he meant by that, people usually don't have this discussion, but we can give it a shot and see how it goes. What he meant by that was that struggling out of the family, the primary family, is very, very difficult. So I can give you an example. So I had another client, very bright guy, second generation guy from the Middle East. And he was heading for a pretty good career. He's a smart guy. He'd done a lot of work to get this career going. He's in a position that was difficult to obtain. He had moved to a different city in order to pursue this career. And his parents were very upset that he was moving off the street they lived in. Okay, so from the Western perspective, roughly speaking, this is where it gets tricky. The proper thing to do on behalf of the parents would have been to support him in his attempts to establish himself independently. But the parents' perspective was, you're betraying the family by moving away. Now the question is, is it reasonable to presume that independence is an absolute value? I mean, we're having wars about this, that's for sure. The wars have been going on for a long time. For Rogers, if you didn't value independence, you couldn't get going in this form of therapy. Freud thought that all cultures were eatable, to one degree or another, and Jung thought that wasn't true for Northern Europeans. And that was part of the reason why Jung and Freud came to a crossroads. So, you can think about that. But in any case, for Rogers, only independence-valued individuals were suited for client-centered therapy. Here's more SES.
Well, and as I think, you can be truly honest, or if you will, if you're not. That's another definition of independence, in a sense, from a term point of view.
Good point.
I don't know if you can be completely consistent with yourself and your family.
Well, that's a very useful way. That's a very useful way of phrasing your question, that's a very useful way of phrasing the issue. Can you be, if you're honest, does that mean you're independent? It's a good question. Might mean that, because it means that you're, at least say again let's take it from the Rogerian perspective. If you're speaking for yourself, now that would be yourself in relationship to other people, the integrated self, right, not the kind of instrumental, useless self that's wandering around causing trouble. There's still your unique position that has to be contended with, right? And the fact that you're your own kind of bounded entity with its own destiny and path and its own particular biological structure. And it's possible that the way that you define independence is that that particularity is properly integrated into the collective. So that's a good issue. Okay, assuming a minimal mutual willingness to be in contact and to receive communications, we may say that the greater the communicated congruence of experience, awareness, and behavior on the part of one individual, the more the ensuing relationship will involve a tendency toward reciprocal communication with the same qualities, mutually accurate understanding of the communications, improved psychological adjustment and functioning in both parties, and mutual satisfaction in the relationship. Pretty good hypothesis. So basically what he's saying is that if we're communicating, and I tell you what's actually going on with me the best I possibly can, and try to get rid of all the motives that have nothing to do with communication, then that's going to work out quite nicely in the long run. It's going to work out for both of us and for the relationship. It's good. It's an interesting hypothesis. I can tell you that people don't do this. I showed you that Gottman, I don't know how many of you looked at that link, the Gottman studies on marital satisfaction. Right? But I thought that was really interesting because I see people like that lots of times. They're on the surface, everything's fine, but well, sometimes the tension is so high you can hardly even stand to be in the room with the people, because you can just, at an embodied level, you're mirroring the distress. You get a pit in your stomach, it's hard to breathe, and you just know. It's probably smell, I think, is what it's communicated by. Smell affects us in all sorts of ways we don't understand. So here's an example. Women like the smell of t-shirts that men wore if the men are symmetrical better than if the men aren't symmetrical. So that's a good example of how smell affects you. It affects you in lots of ways. So anyways, what Gottman observed was that basically the couples that weren't getting along were just lying to each other all the time, right? Because they were pretending that everything was all right, when in fact nothing was all right at all. Their bodies were going haywire. That's a technical term, haywire. So it was way too stressful for them. And you might say, well, why is that bad? Why shouldn't you be like that? Because that's a good question. Well, one is, if your stress responses are too elevated, we know what happens. That's the generalized stress response. Your cortisol levels go up, and then you age fast. So if you want to age fast, that's a very good way of doing it. But if that's not your goal, your goal is peace and harmony, then pretending that everything's all right without communicating isn't going to work. And so the couples aren't saying things like, there's something about the way we're talking that's making me extremely nervous. And then actually trying to figure that out. It's like I wouldn't say, well, you're making me nervous, because, well, maybe you are, maybe not. Maybe I'm just the nervous type. God only knows. Let's see if we can sort this out. Or maybe I'm nervous about something else completely. Maybe I'm nervous about women. So there's lots of digging to do. Okay, so you can think about that, and you can think, well, is that a reasonable proposition? Now, you can try this. This is an excellent, I'm not going to tell you many specific psychological exercises, but this is a really good one. It's hard, too. Real communication occurs, and the evaluative tendency avoided when we listen with understanding. So Rogers' theory is difficult to understand with regards to the relationship between evaluation and unconditional positive regard, because he tends to speak as if evaluation is bad. But really what he means is hierarchical evaluation, which is you're worse than me, or I'm better than you. So those things might even be true in any given case, but they're not relevant to what we're doing. Right? We're trying to do something other than that. So when that creeps in, I think of that as dominance hierarchy maneuvering. That happens all the time when people are talking. They're just maneuvering around in a dominance hierarchy. They're not trying to communicate. So that's the evaluative tendency. What does this mean? It means to see the expressed idea and attitude from the other person's point of view, to sense how it feels to him, to achieve his frame of reference in regard to the thing he is talking about. Stated so briefly, this may sound absurdly simple, but it is not. It's an approach which we have found extremely potent in the field of psychotherapy. It's the most effective agent we know for altering the basic personality structure of an individual and improving his relationships and his communications with others. That's quite the statement, The most effective agent we know for altering the basic personality structure of an individual. If I can listen to what he tells me, if I can understand how it seems to him, if I can see its personal meaning for him, if I can sense the emotional flavor which it has for him, then I will be releasing potent forces of change in him. If I can really understand how he hates his father or the university or communists, if I can catch the flavor of his fear of insanity or his fear of atom bombs or of Russia, it will be of the greatest help to him in altering those very hatreds and fears and in establishing realistic and harmonious relationships with the very people and situations towards which he has felt hatred and fear. We know from our research, and by the way, Rogers was one of the first clinicians who empirically evaluated the outcome of psychotherapy. And so he actually more or less established the idea that therapy outcomes should be measured scientifically. And in doing that, in some sense, he set down one element of the standards by which modern clinical psychologists are actually trained in practice, because the modern clinical psychologist is a scientist practitioner. So the idea is that you should be trained as a researcher and as a practitioner, and that's quite unique. Doctors, medical doctors, for example, are not trained that way, although you could make a very strong case that they should be. We know from our research that such empathic understanding with a person, not about him, is such an effective approach that can bring about major changes in personality. Now, some of you may be feeling that you listen well to people and that you've never seen such results. The chances are very great indeed that your listening has not been of the type I have described. Fortunately, I can suggest a little laboratory experiment which you can try to test the quality of your understanding. The next time you get into an argument with your wife, or your friend, or with a small group of friends, stop the discussion for a moment, and for an experiment, institute this rule. Each person can only speak up for himself once he has first restated the ideas and feelings of the previous speaker accurately, and to that speaker's satisfaction. Now that's the annoying part, right? Because if you're in an argument, you're going to use all sorts of rhetorical devices in order to win. And one of the most obvious of those rhetorical devices is that you make your case, and I only half listen because I'm formulating what I'm going to say to you next, and then I impose a bias in my processing of your argument, and so that what I address when I talk to you is the sort of argument that you'd make if you were weak and stupid and contemptible. And then I go after that, and that's basically a straw man approach, right? I take your position, and I try to make it into the scrawniest little rattiest thing I can possibly manage, illustrating that it needs to be rubbed out, and then I rub it out. It's like the Rogerian approach is actually exactly the opposite. And by the way, it's the approach that Dostoevsky took to his characters when he wrote his great novels, and it's also the approach that all great novelists take to their character. Because if you're a great novelist, you put yourself inside the head of the murderer, right? And Dostoevsky was great at that. So in Crime and Punishment, for example, the main character, Raskolnikov, he's a law student, and he's all obsessed because he's lost his faith in God, and he's got all these weird ideas that emerged in Europe at the end of the 1800s that if there's no God, everything is permitted. And so he's thinking, well, am I moral just because I'm a coward, which was a Nietzschean proposition. Actually, Nietzsche said most morality is cowardice. He didn't say that morality was cowardice. He said most of the time when people are being cowardly, they pretend that's moral, which is absolutely right. Anyways, he's wrestling with this idea that morality is just cowardice, and that once fundamental beliefs have disappeared, you can do anything you want, and the only thing that's there to stop you is your own fear. So that's rattling around the back of his head. Now, at the same time, he's more or less starving to death. And his sister is going to essentially prostitute herself to raise enough money so that he can stay in law school. Now, it's not exactly that. She's going to go off and marry this guy that she doesn't love who's quite rich. And she's going to do that to keep him in law school. So that sort of sucks. You know, he's not very happy about that. And then he's living in this horrible flop house, and the woman who runs it is, Dostoevsky sets this up quite nicely. She's the sort of person that if she was run over by a horse cart, everyone would be pleased. She's grasping and miserly and horrible and mean and malevolent and cruel and all those things. And then to make it even worse, she has this niece who isn't very bright that she basically treats as a slave and tortures and orders around all the time. And then she has all these people who are living in her building and she doesn't take care of, and she's just grasping money out of them all the time. And she doesn't do anything with money, she just puts it in a little chest. And she lives like on breadcrumbs and, you know, dust. And so Dostoevsky's very careful to set this situation up. It's like, okay, is there such a thing as right or wrong? Well, Raskolnikov, he's pretty puzzled about that. Plus, he's hungry, and he's drinking too much, and, you know, he doesn't eat properly. Well, that's why he's hungry. And so his head is a little on the adult side. And then he's got this terrible moral conundrum. It's like there's this horrible woman, and she's torturing her niece, and then his sister's going to go into a loveless marriage, and he can't stay in law school. And so he rationalizes. He says, oh, here's a solution, man. I'll just get rid of that old woman. No one's going to miss her, man. I'll be doing the world a favor by getting rid of her. And then I'll take her money, and then my sister doesn't have to become a prostitute, roughly speaking. And I get to go to law school, and I'm going to be a good guy, and so, poof, perfect. And if there's no ultimate right and wrong, then I'm set. It's an instrumental argument, right? Well, so he kills her. Well, and you have to read the book if you want the rest of the story. Suffice it to say that things do not go exactly as he predicted. So the first thing he figures out is that the person you are before you hit someone with an axe and the person you are immediately after you hit someone with an axe are not the same persons. So, you know, he assumes constancy of identity across every experience. That turns out to be seriously wrong. So, and Dostoevsky, man, he does it's a terrifying book. It's the most psychologically accurate book I ever read, I think. But the reason I'm telling you about it is, this is what made Dostoevsky so courageous. It's like he generated up a murderer who was basically him as a young man. And he gave this kid every reason to murder. Everyone he could think up, he tried to make the case for murder as strong as he could possibly make it. So he wasn't generating up some, you know, two-dimensional bad guy. And then he has the argument. And so that's so brilliant, hey, because if I really want to have a discussion with you, and I want to get somewhere, wherever somewhere might be, I want to help you make your argument as strong as you can, on the off chance that you have something to say that I don't know. And maybe you'll do the same to me, and then we can have the discussion, and we can get the thing solved, and then maybe it won't be around to plague us anymore. Well, people don't do that in relationships, you know. What they do is maintain fragile peace. And I actually think that probably works if you're bounded by roles. And this was a Jungian observation. So Jung believed that you didn't have to have an individual relationship if you were in a traditional culture, because women did women things and men did men things, and they walked along the path in parallel, and there were no conflicts, because there were, but, you know, most of what you were supposed to do was laid out for you. And, you know, modern people don't like that idea, but just try negotiating over who should cook dinner. See if you can settle that before you make a decision about whether roles are useful or not. Because, you know, I've been in lots of houses where that fight had been going on for 35 years. Never solved. So kids couldn't eat, the food was terrible, the husband and the wife were at each other's throats, you know, fun. So it's really hard once you're out of the roles. Once you're out of the roles, you have to do it as an individual, but that's a tremendous demand. It's an unbelievable demand. It's the same demand that essentially that Dostoevsky put on himself. It's like, we're partners, we'll say. You are one weird and unwieldy and malevolent and peculiar creature, and so am I. So, like, how the hell are we going to sort that out? Well, you better be awake if you're going to sort that out. But the alternative is the Gottman situation, right? Everything's fine, and your heart's racing, and your cortisol is generating, and, you know, you're having murderous dreams. I've had clients who were very motivated to commit homicide, and they had their reasons. And the one client I'm thinking about, she thought it was her moral duty to do this, because the person that she hated had really hurt their family. Like, not in some trivial way, but like, hurt them as badly as she possibly could. But there was nothing she could do about it. There was no legal recourse. And so she was a very moral person. In fact, somewhat, I would say, doesn't matter. She's a very moral person. This was just driving her crazy. It's like, I have to act, I have to act. I can't just let this person get away with it. Because it was also ongoing. Well, what are you going to say? Well, stop thinking about that. You know, you could put your thoughts to a more productive use. It's like, it's not helpful. You can't help a person like that at all until you put yourself in their situation. You think, okay, if I was in that situation and that had happened, what would I do? And then the first thing I thought was, oh, I'd be having the same kind of murderous fantasies. So that doesn't seem like, it's possible that that's not a great solution. So let's see if we can come up with something else. But the danger there is that you have to put yourself in that situation. And people don't like to do that because they think, well, I'd never have murderous fantasies. It's like, if you would never have murderous fantasies, I would actually say there's something wrong with you. If you're not capable of that, then there's a half of you missing. It's in there, man. And when someone's pushing on you at some point in your life, and they will, you better have that reserve capacity or they're just going to mow you right over. So you can see what this would mean. It would simply mean that before presenting your own point of view, it would be necessary for you to really achieve the other speaker's frame of reference, to understand his thoughts and feelings so well that you could summarize them for him. Sounds simple, doesn't it? But if you try it, you will discover it is one of the most difficult things you have ever tried to do. However, once you have been able to see the other's point of view, your own comments will have to be drastically revised. You will also find the emotion going out of the discussion, the differences being reduced, and those differences which remain being of a rational and understandable sort. So Rogers thought that courage was a prerequisite for empathic understanding. It's interesting, too, because, you know, here's a question for you. It's like, should you trust people? Or more specifically, you know, should I trust you? Well, you might think, if you've heard me talk, you'd think, well, there's no way you should trust a person because they're just so full of snakes and malevolence that it's just absolutely mind-boggling. So why in the world would you ever trust something like that? Well, then you can think about it this way. There's two kinds of trust. There's the kind of trust you have when you're too stupid to know better, and that's not trust, that's naivete, and that is not a moral virtue. And there's the kind of trust you have when you know that the person you're talking to and you are completely full of snakes, and you decide, as an act of courage, that you're going to trust the person anyways, because that, of all the things you could do to help lead them and the discussion towards the light, that's the most important. It's like, I'm going to assume that in our interactions, your impulse towards the good is going to be victorious. Now, is it? If you're interested in this, you can go online, you can watch Paul Bernardo. Remember old Paul Bernardo? Okay, there's videos of Paul Bernardo online when he's talking to a bunch of RCMP officers and judges. They're trying to extract some more information from him about some murders that remained unsolved. You want to see a psychopath in operation, you can just watch those videos. It's amazing. He runs the meeting like he's the CEO of Apple. It's amazing. So, and that's a problem, I would say, to some degree for the Rogerian approach, right? Because, well, what about Paul Bernardo? You know, is everyone fundamentally oriented towards the good? Well, it's a reasonable presupposition most of the time, I think. It works better if societies organize themselves according to that principle, because otherwise we know, for example, that one of the, you might think, what's a natural resource? Oil, right? Or bauxite, or iron ore, or forget about all that. The fundamental natural resource is trust. So if you look around the world and you look at economies like Japan, for example, Japan has no natural resources, right? Well, they're filthy rich. Why? Because the economy is basically predicated on interpersonal trust. So, and there's been some lovely work done in economics regarding precisely that. Without trust, your oil just sits in the ground or leaks out of the pipelines because nobody welded them properly. You know, there's no reason to assume that you're going to be able to do anything cooperative or collaborative. So trust is a necessity. If you're really willing to understand a person in this way, if you're willing to enter his private world and see the way life appears to him, you run the risk of being changed yourself. You might see it his way. You might find yourself influenced in your attitudes or personality. The risk of being changed is one of the most frightening prospects most of us can face. If I enter as fully as I am able into the private world of the neurotic or psychotic individual, isn't there a risk that I might become lost in that world? Most of us are afraid to take that risk. The great majority of us cannot listen. We find ourselves compelled to evaluate because listening is too dangerous. The first requirement is courage, and we do not always have it. So it says 3 o'clock on this. Is that right? Well, that's a good place to stop then. We talked about phenomenology last time, and I tried to make the case that phenomenology, at least in part, was an attempt to include the entire domain of subjective experience inside the definition of reality. When Rogers talked about mental health, he was speaking of something that superseded just rational coherence. I mean, Rogers also touched on a topic that's become very well developed since the time of Rogers, which is the topic of embodied cognition. It's become increasingly clear to artificial intelligence researchers particularly that the Enlightenment idea of rationality as a disembodied sort of spiritual function is wrong in principle. And I think that's because the way the brain sets itself up with the body is the way that we discussed when we were talking about Piaget. It's that the mind is built from motor actions up, and the concepts that the mind uses aren't abstract categories that describe reality. They're more like tools that allow us to do things in the world. And so they're predicated, their validity is predicated on the fact that we have a body. And one of the things that Rogers was trying to emphasize, and I think there's a long history of this in Western thought over the last few thousand years, that there are faculties of apprehension that are higher than rationality, and some of those are embodied. So it's a very anti-Freudian theory, because the Freudians, of course, thought that it was necessary to attend to emotions and motivational states and to integrate them with the ego. But it takes that idea further, in some sense, by treating the inputs of the body, so motivational states and emotions, but also perhaps the capacity to mirror other people, as a prerequisite for mental health. And so the other thing that Rogers emphasizes is to pay attention to how it is that your experiential field is manifesting itself while you speak and interact with other people. And he was hoping and striving towards a kind of unification. It was analogous to the unification that I described to you that Jung talked about in his last book. There's another practical element to this that I should tell you that I think is unbelievably useful. And we talked last time a little bit about the necessity of listening to people and techniques that you could use to do that in the effort to improve your communications and also to improve the degree to which you were gathering information that was practically useful to you and corrective. But with the Rogerian techniques, to some degree, you can do the same thing with regards to the relationship between your intellectual rationality, which is sort of your knowledge as represented at the highest level of verbal abstraction, and the platform on which that knowledge is hypothetically implemented. So you can imagine in the Piagetian mode of development, you start to learn how to move, and then those movements are chained in ever more complex sequences, and those sequences start to become representable abstractly, so that you can describe yourself, for example, as a good person, and hypothetically, as you decompose the idea of good person down towards specific actions, that whole hierarchy is internally consistent in that you're a good person in your self-representation, but you also enact all the things that a good person would enact, and then there's no flaws in the entire hierarchy. But the weird thing about having an intelligence that's dissociable, which means that you can think up things without acting them out, is that you can also formulate self-representations and ideas that aren't fully integrated with the manner in which you actually act. So you can have a concept of yourself and even an ideological framework that's only vaguely related to the programming that's been instantiated in your body. And Rogers would consider that, he has a technical term for it. It's a form of internal disharmony, non-congruence, that's his term. And the non-congruence idea is a very interesting one because, in my experience, you can feel it. So, and here's something that you can try as an experiment. And I think it's as effective an experiment as the listening experiment that we discussed last time. So, it's very common for modern people, especially intelligent modern people, to identify themselves with the contents of their intellect. But that's a strange thing to do in many ways, because first of all, obviously, you're not just the contents of your intellect, you're also your emotions and your motivations and your body and so forth, and your embeddedness within a social context. But especially if you're intelligent, it's tempting to identify yourself with the contents of your intellect. But there's no reason to assume whatsoever that those contents are in fact congruent with the programming of your body, or even with its natural inclinations. And that's partly because the fact that you can abstract also means that you can learn abstractly, and that means you can pull in concepts from the world at a level of abstraction that may have virtually nothing to do with you. And that's certainly the case if you're educated, because you read all sorts of things. And the reading and all the investigating that you do at an abstract level allows you to have theories about being and theories about yourself, but there's no necessity that those theories about being and yourself have any basis in who or what you actually are. And so that makes you inauthentic. That's the existential perspective. And the Rogerian perspective would be incongruent. You're not a singular entity at all the multiple levels at which you exist. And that can cause conflict. So, for example, maybe you're acting out an ideology because you're convinced of its rational integrity and coherence and utility, but that ideology doesn't fulfill you as an individual. Now, that's certainly an existential claim. It's a fundamental existential claim. In fact, as we'll talk about in the next lecture, there are thinkers like Solzhenitsyn who've ascribed the worst catastrophes of the 20th century to exactly that kind of
my paper.
We're here and we're going to do some ghost hunting.
inauthenticity, which is the development of a coherent and rational ideology, say like a communist ideology, and then the attempt to force that on the world and on people, despite the fact that the rational formulation and the reality of the people and the world have very little in common. Now, how would you detect your own inauthenticity or your own incongruence? Well, Rogers had this idea that he called subception, which was maybe something that you might regard as a sixth sense. It's sort of like a propriocentric perception, and that's the perception that you have of your body as it's reacting and localized in time and space. And so it's sort of like touch, the feeling, but it's your sense of how you're reacting internally and where you are. And a lot of that is subserved by the autonomic nervous system, which is reporting to you about various states of being in your body. Rogers believed that you could use the information that's being provided to you from your body, sort of bottom up, to determine when you were being inauthentic or non-congruent. And I thought about this for a long time and tried to sort it out in a practical manner, and what I've concluded is this. You can try this for a couple of weeks. It's an extremely interesting exercise. So you sort of have to detach yourself from your thoughts and what you say. So you got to assume, you start by assuming that what you say and what you think is not necessarily you. And of course that's just the case, because a lot of what you think, in fact most of what you think and most of what you say, are the opinions of other people. They're things you've read or things people have told you. You know, that's a benefit in some ways because you get all those thoughts that other people have spent a long time formulating, but it's a disadvantage in that it's not exactly you. Okay, so you detach yourself from that. You're no longer your thoughts or the things that you say, or maybe you're no longer all of them. And now what you're going to try to find out is which of your thoughts and things that you say are you, and maybe so you can not utilize the rest, or maybe so that you can correct the rest, because they're not representative of yourself as an integrated being. They don't take everything into account. My sense has been that you can tell when you're saying something that's not authentic by feeling out whether or not it makes you weak or strong. Now, you know, sometimes when you're conversing with people, you can say something that embarrasses yourself. Now, Nietzsche said, for example, everyone has perjured themselves at least once in the attempt to maintain their good name. Something like that. It's not an exact quote, but I've got the gist of it right. So maybe you're saying things to impress someone, or you're saying things to remain part of your political group or your social group or whatever, or maybe you have attributes, personal attributes, that might be positive, that you're ashamed of, and so you're not going to speak about them. So there's a falseness about your self-representation. Watch for 2 weeks and see. Make a rule that if you start to say something and it makes you feel weak, it's hard to describe exactly what that means. To me, what it means is that I can feel things coming apart, sort of in my midsection, so I think it's an autonomic phenomena. And the subjective sense is of falsehood. It's like I just stepped off the solid ground and onto something that doesn't support me well, and it feels like a self-betrayal, so that's existential inauthenticity. You can feel it right away. And then the rule is, shut up if that happens. Stop talking. And then feel around and see if you can find some words that you can say in that situation that don't produce that sensation. And it's like, you see this played out in different forms of drama. So there's a scene in The Lord of the Rings, for example, where I believe it's Gollum and Bilbo? It's The Lord of the Rings. It's Bilbo. It's The Lord of the Rings, not the Hobbit, because the Hobbit's Frodo, right? So it's Bilbo. Have I got it wrong? It's the other way around? Okay, so Gollum and Frodo, yes, are going across this swamp. And the swamp is essentially full of dead souls. And they have to step very carefully in order to not fall off the track. And the stones are sort of hidden underneath the surface. And the implication there is that in order to follow a trail properly, you have to pick your ground very carefully. And you have to test it to see if it's solid, or you'll slip off into this, well, essentially what it is chaos. You'll slip off into chaos. And that's a dramatic representation of what I'm suggesting to you. It's like, all you have to do is notice, and you have to pay attention. And so to some degree what you're doing, in fact, is you're making your capacity to pay attention superordinate to your capacity to think and to speak. Because you might ask yourself, well, exactly what are you? Well, I said you can identify yourself with your intellect, and that's very, very common. It's sort of like the worst sin of intelligent people. But that isn't all you are. And there are lots of reasons for making the assumption that attention is a higher order function than intellect, because attention is what teaches intellect. So if you pay very, very careful attention to what you say without bringing the automatic assumption that what you say is you to bear on the conversation, and then also to feel like you have to defend it once you say it, you'll find very rapidly that very much of what you think and say has absolutely nothing to do with you. It's the dead souls that are in that little scene that I described to you, sort of manifesting themselves in your head. They're dead ideas that other people have created, and some of them might be applicable to you. You might have the right to them, so to speak, but lots of them won't, and you're using the words as camouflage or self-defense or as an attempt to attain status in a status hierarchy, or to make yourself look smarter than you are, or there's all sorts of reasons, or to hide what you think from other people. I see this in undergraduate essays all the time. So, because the essays are full of cliches, and it's not all that obvious why a cliche is a bad thing, but a cliche is a bad thing in the same way that being possessed by the dead is a bad thing. It's like a cliche isn't you. It's something else. It's like the crowd. It's like the other. It's not living. It has nothing to do with you. And part of the reason that students use cliches is because it's easier than using your own genuine creative formulation. So you can just default to cliche use, but there's something more insidious than that, is that if you write an essay that's nothing but a string of cliches, and you get criticized, then you're not being criticized. What's being criticized is the cliches, and you can hide behind that, and the part of you that's wise but treacherous thinks, well, the criticism doesn't really apply to me because, I didn't really say what I thought. And then there's this kind of sense you get that you've gotten away with something, which is a terrible thing. So when I read undergraduate essays, what I see very frequently is, especially the first essay, it's just nothing but cliches. It's awful. It's dull. You can hardly stand reading it because there's nothing in it that's gripping or alive. And then maybe the second essay, you can see there's a layer of cliche, and then now and then the person will be brave enough to poke up a thought of their own. It'll just sort of poke up somewhere maybe in 3 pages in. It's like this little green shoot that's barely alive, and the person is brave enough to pop it up in the hope that, maybe it won't get walloped down with a sledgehammer. And so one of the things I try to do is to point that out. It's like, look, this is something, there's a real thought here. It's a real original thought. It's something that you have the right to because it's derived from your own experience and your own knowledge, and you formulated it in an original and compelling way. But the problem with that is that if you get criticized for that, you're just going to pull right back into your shell, right? Because that hurts, because it's actually part of you that you've exposed, and that's a terrifying thing, to expose yourself like that. But it's an absolute prerequisite to genuine communication and thought. So the ancient Mesopotamians, I haven't got time to tell you this story. If you want to hear it, you can come to my Maps of Meaning class in your 4th year. But the ancient Mesopotamians had figured out 5,000 years ago or so that the highest god in the hierarchy of gods, so sort of like the highest value, or the thing that should be imitated most carefully, was a god whose head had eyes all the way around it, and who spoke magic words. And so the words he spoke could make the sun rise and make the sun set. Very, very powerful speaker. And the reason the Mesopotamians had figured this out to the degree they had was because they realized that the capacity to pay attention, which is the eyes, of course, because we really pay attention with our eyes, and then the capacity to speak properly is, in fact, the highest virtue. And so then you can check yourself. You can see. All you have to do is listen, like you would listen to someone else. And you have to feel. You think, do I actually believe that? Is that actually my thought? And really, I'll tell you, what you'll find is 95% of what you say has nothing to do with you. So it's quite shocking to do this, because you'll start to say something, and you'll think, oh, that doesn't feel quite right. Like, it doesn't make me feel solid when I say it. There's something about that I'm subordinating myself to something or hiding in some way. It's very difficult to figure out exactly what you're doing. But you'll find out that almost everything that's abstractly represented, it has to be that way because you guys are also young. So in some sense, you know way more than you can actually know, right? You've been taught all these things, but you don't know them. They're just in your head. In fact, they have you rather than the other way around. It's like Carl Jung said, people don't have ideas. Ideas have people. And that's something to really think about, because then you want to watch and see what ideas there are floating around in your head and start to figure out where they came from, because it's highly probable that they're controlling you just like a marionette is controlled by the puppeteer. It's very, very similar. And there's an inauthenticity about that. And so that brings us into existentialism. So now I want to talk to you a little bit about existentialists, because existentialists are very concerned with authenticity. And so you could say that above all else, existentialists are concerned with truth. Now, of course, we know that it's not very easy to define exactly what constitutes truth. And I would also say there are various definitions of truth that can be used for different purposes. You know, because your definitions of truth can also have a tool-like function. And finally, that we can't come up with an ultimate definition of truth because we're not infinitely informed, right? So ignorance is going to underlie our claims all the time. But that doesn't eradicate the validity of the concept of truth. And I think one of the ways you can deal with that existentially is that you may not be able to determine what's true at any given moment, but it's quite a different matter to determine what's false. That's a lot easier. So one of the things I have to tell my clients, for example, is here's a way to clean up your life. Stop doing the things that you know are wrong that you could stop doing. Right? So it's a fairly limited attempt. First of all, we're not going to say that you know what the good is or what the truth is in any ultimate sense. But we will presume that there are things that you're doing that for one reason or another you know are not in your best interests. There's something about them that you just know you should stop. They're kind of self-evident to you. Other things you're going to be doubtful about. You're not going to know which way is up and which way is down. But there are things that you're doing that you know you shouldn't do. Now, some of those you won't stop doing for whatever reason. You don't have the discipline, or maybe there's a secondary payoff, or you don't believe it's necessary, or it's too much of a sacrifice, or you're angry or resentful or afraid. Who knows? So forget about those for now. But there's another subset that you could stop doing. It might be a little thing. Well, that's fine. Stop doing it and see what happens. And what will happen is your vision will clear a little bit. And then something else will pop up in your field of apprehension that you will also know you should stop doing, and that you could stop doing because you've strengthened yourself a bit by stopping doing the particular stupid thing that you were doing before. That just puts you together a little bit more. And you could do that repeatedly for an indefinite period of time. And you know, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to ever be able to formulate a clear and final picture of what constitutes the truth and the good. But it does mean that you'll be able to continually move away from what's untruth and what's bad. And you know, that's not a bad start. Now, Solzhenitsyn, who we'll talk a lot about in the next lecture, Solzhenitsyn was a great Russian writer. He wrote a book called The Gulag Archipelago, which was instrumental in bringing down the Soviet Union. And Solzhenitsyn, like Viktor Frankl, who you'll also read, was very much convinced that the reason the horrors of the Soviet Union and of Nazi Germany and of Mao's China and various other places around the world, he was very convinced that the reason those horrors took place, the death and torture of hundreds of millions of people, was because the individuals that made up those societies were inauthentic in their own use of thought and speech. And so it isn't a following orders theory. It's not that at all. It's a bottom-up pathology theory. It's the reason the whole state is pathological is because the individuals that compose it are pathological, not because they're good in following orders. So I believe that to be the case. I do believe that the catastrophes of the state are a consequence of the amalgamated pathologies of the individuals, especially their willful blindness. And so another thing that you might think about, because most young people do think about this, is what is it that you can do in order to aid the world, let's say, like you might if you were thinking about being an environmentalist. Well, as far as I can tell, the one sure route to aiding the world is to clean up your existential space. First of all, you're not telling anyone else what to do. That's a big plus. And second, well, the more you do that, the more you're going to be able to do things. You know, and so you might think, well, if you're going to clean up the world, you might start by cleaning up your phenomenological space and see how far you get with that. It's a very difficult thing to do, but if you do it, the better you get at it, the more capable you are of handling larger and larger problems. And that's how you should start. You should start with what's right in your grasp and with what you can control. And that enables you to practice. Now, here's an offshoot of this. This is an existential offshoot. So here's a hypothesis. So you imagine the existentialists continually claim, unlike the psychoanalysts, that people are psychopathological not because, say, of childhood trauma or neurosis or repression or failure to integrate elements of the id into the ego. The existentialists claim that the reason that people are psychopathological is because the conditions of existence are so tragic that it's inevitable that people become psychopathological. Right, and that's, okay, so what's the argument? Well, people are self-conscious, so that's a big problem. And because we're self-conscious, we know that we're going to die. We're aware of our temporal limitations, so that's a real catastrophe, because no other animal has that problem. Like elephants look like they've got some kind of a dim apprehension of it, but they're not articulate, so they can't really get to the final stage of, you know, assessing their existence in relationship to its finitude. And of course, everyone knows that they're prone to illness of all sorts and aging, and that, you know, so is everyone else they know. And that you can be damaged incomprehensibly by untruth and by falsehood and by betrayal, you know, and also that there's 150 things wrong with you that you're acutely aware of at almost all times. So you fall short of perfection along pretty much any axis of comparison that you wish to generate. And so the existential point of view on that is that all of that's enough to make the default condition of human beings psychopathological. It's like the weight of existence itself is sufficient to make normal pathological. And it's a very powerful argument, because one of the things you might ask, and it's certainly something I've asked when I've dealt with people who have agoraphobia, for example, who are afraid to go out, they're afraid to go out because they might have a heart attack, and then they'll be too far away from the hospital, and then they'll die while they make fools of themselves. That's basically the agoraphobic fear. So it's biological mortality plus social exposure, right? It's bad enough to die, but if you die in public while everyone's looking at you, then you get the worst of both worlds. And it is, to me, it's not such a mystery that people are agoraphobic. It's a mystery that other people aren't. And from the existential point of view, the mystery starts to become the ubiquity of normality given the intolerable conditions of existence. It's a much more powerful viewpoint. I think it's correct too, because there's no reason to assume that the default condition of mankind is like calm, rational acceptance of fate. It's like you have to have very, very specific conditions that you're in before you're calm and feeling comfortable and sort of hopeful about the future. It's like that's a rare state to achieve. We can assume that's normal, at least to some degree in our society, because it's unbelievably technologically sophisticated, and we're not hungry that often, we're not cold that often, or even sick that often. But to think of that as the norm, it's like no, definitely not. It's a miracle that it's ever like that. Now, the other claim the existentialists make fundamentally is something like this: is like, well, if the fundamental conditions of existence are tragic, at minimum, because there's worse, there's evil too, which is different than tragedy. Because evil is sort of like unnecessary tragedy, because there's earthquakes, say, and who are you going to blame about that? But then there's you going to school, and there's 4 people who got it out for you, and all they do is pound you flat every time you enter the building or make fun of you and try to torture you to death. That's not tragedy. It's not your accidental subjugation to fate. It's some horror show perpetrated on you by people whose only goal is to make sure that there's more suffering in the world rather than less. So you also have to put up with that. But we'll leave that aside for the time being. You're stuck in your pathology because the conditions of existence are intolerable to a self-conscious being. We'll say that. So then you might ask, well, what could you do about that? Well, here's one potential answer, and that answer is, see what happens if you stop doing things you know to be inadequate and wrong. So the hypothesis is every time you engage in an activity like that, you weaken yourself. You put yourself down first, you remove your own self-confidence, but you also fail to take the opportunity to expand your domain of competence. What would life be like if you didn't do that? And the existential claim is, it's a weak claim in some ways. The claim is, well, there's two. One is, if you don't do that, if you don't try to fix the things that you could fix, things will go from bad to worse for your life, and that will spread out, and it will take everyone else's life along with it. So that's on the negative end. So you don't do it because of the negative end. But then there's a positive claim too, which is maybe if you stopped bullying yourself, the tragic conditions of existence would become bearable because you would be strong enough to tolerate them. And it's analogous to Jung's idea of progression towards the self, because Jung has a very strong existential theme underlying his work, derived mostly from Nietzsche. But it's the most optimistic, it's the only optimistic hypothesis I've ever seen in psychology. Truly optimistic hypothesis, because there's other hypotheses like the positive illusion hypothesis, which is basically life is so tragic that you have to tell yourself, happy falsehoods just so you don't go insane, and that's what normal people do, which I think is an absolutely appalling philosophy. It's the ultimate in cynicism, that. But still, there's a huge literature on the supposed utility of positive illusions. And then there's also the associated sort of terror management hypothesis, which is that the purpose of your belief systems is to protect you from the anxiety of death, which is sort of a variant of the Freudian idea that religion was a childish delusion designed to protect people from terror of their own mortality. It's a very powerful critique of religion, although it's one that I happen to think is wrong. I mean, one of the problems with Freud's formulation is that it fails to deal with concepts like the underworld and hell. I mean, if you're going to just whip up a belief system to protect yourself against the fear of death, why in the world would you envision something like an eternity of suffering worse than death if you ever step out of line? It's very hard to understand how that's a defense mechanism. Now, a cynic would say, well, the only reason that, say, Christians invented hell, even though they didn't, it's a very old idea, is so that they had somewhere convenient to put people who didn't agree with them. But you have to be unbelievably cynical to assume that that's the only reason. And I don't think there's any historical support for the idea that that's the only reason. Now, I'm going to tell you some stories that some of the most famous existentialists in history told. They're ideas and quotations, and the existentialists that I've read are often the most powerful of writers. So Dostoevsky is an existentialist, and Solzhenitsyn is an existentialist, and so is Viktor Frankl, who survived the concentration camps, and Kierkegaard. Very weird collection of people. I mean, their fundamental belief systems were often very much at odds with one another. Some of them are atheists, and some of them are Orthodox Christians, especially because a lot of the literary existentialists were Russian. So you can come at existentialism from a variety of origin points, but what they have in common is what I kind of outlined, is that the first idea is that essential preconditions of life are sufficiently tragic to render the normative state of humanity pathological, and health and health and wholeness is something very difficult to aspire to or accomplish, and that the road to that health is the reduction of deceit. And so that's a thing that's also very interesting about the existentialists, because they make a very straightforward moral claim, which is that lies make people sick. And I'll tell you, in my experience as a psychotherapist, I mean, I can tell you some of the things that make people sick. A lot of them have nothing to do with the psyche. The things that make people sick are, well, they get unemployed. It's like unemployment just lays people out, especially if they're conscientious. They just devour themselves. And it's so stressful, right? Because if you're unemployed, well, your finances become shaky almost right away. Plus, you don't have any routine. Plus, you're not involved in anything meaningful in relationship to society. And then you start to eat yourself up with doubts and self-criticism, especially if you're a conscientious person, or especially if you're a conscientious person who's high in negative emotions. Like, unemployment will just flatten you. And then the death or illness of yourself or a close relative, that's really hard on people. And there are situations at work that are difficult. So people are bullied. Maybe they have a terrible supervisor, or they're in a pathological social structure, so that they're basically being bullied and oppressed with every step they take, or they're in a very horrendous relationship. But then things start to turn a bit. So you can lose your job, and you can be ill or dying, and so can people around you, and that'll lay you low a lot of the time. And no wonder, right? It's logical. And when people come to me with those sorts of problems, the first thing I often note is they're not psychological. I tell the people that's not a psychological problem. You're unemployed. That's an actual problem. And it's really useful to distinguish those, right? So for example, and this is something that psychiatric diagnosis does very, very badly. If someone comes to me and they're depressed, so they're not sleeping properly, they feel terrible in the morning, you know, they don't have a lot of energy, they're having a hard time experiencing any positive emotion, it's difficult for them to move, and they have a lot of negative thoughts about the past and the present and the future. I do an analysis of their life first to say, well, you know, do you have a job that's, you know, all right, that at least isn't horrifying? You know, is it okay for you to go to work in the morning? Do you have an intimate relationship that's basically functional? Do you have some friends? You know, are your relationships with your family members okay? Are you reasonably healthy apart from the depression? And do you have useful and interesting things to do that aren't related to your career? And if the person says yes to all of those and they're still feeling terrible, then I think, okay, this person is depressed, right? Because they don't have a problem, they're just depressed. And in my experience, those are the people who respond quite well to antidepressants. You know, because their nervous system isn't calibrating its analysis of their situation to the reality of the situation. It's as if their lower status, according to their status comparator, which is a very primordial thing, since even lobsters have it, their status comparator isn't paying attention to their actual status. And maybe that's because they're, you know, temperamentally high in negative emotion, or maybe it's because they had been traumatized earlier in their life, and so they're much more sensitive to any signs of failure. It's easier to knock them down. But then you have other people who are, well, they don't have a job, and they never have, and maybe they're 30 or 35, no real stable employment history, no real educational history, it's pretty patchy, one or more illnesses, and then family members who are just out for their absolute destruction. Like, families can be unbelievably pathological, so they're enmeshed in a familial situation where, for one reason or another, as soon as they get up off the ground a little bit, someone knocks them back down. And then maybe they have a drug or alcohol problem to go along with that, or they have a relationship with someone who has a drug and alcohol problem or a mental illness. And sometimes you see people who have like all 5 of those things going on at the same time. It's like, that's not precisely mental illness. Now, a lot of that's associated with deceit. You know, they're entangled in relationships, and in relationships with themselves that are pathologically untrue. So I've seen people, for example, who are in families where probably nothing they were ever told was true. Like, it was never just true. It was always twisted and bent in some way by whoever was talking to them for the purposes of that person, power or domination or positive illusion or delusion or something. Like, all the communication within the family was motivated. And so it's so awful to grow up in an environment like that, because you can't get a grip on what's real. And then, you know, it can get worse than that, in that the person will tell you that they love you and they'll act all sweet, but every time you do anything that's even vaguely productive and useful, they'll just criticize you to death, and all the while telling you that they love you. It's really horrible. And that's all tangled up with deception and lies, and it's a weird thing, because if you look at the Freudian hypotheses, you'll notice that Freud attributed an awful lot of psychopathology to repression, right? But I think the distinction between repression and self-deception or deceit is very permeable. It's like, what's the difference between repressing something and lying to yourself about it? Well, Freud would say often that repression occurs unconsciously, but I really wonder about that. I think that what happens is that something happened, or you did something that you don't like, and it's bothering you, and you could think it through, but you just decide not to. You just don't think it through, so it's left vague and uncertain, and, you know, it's fairly emotionally salient, but you just refuse to think it through, and you practice doing that until you've built up a habit of not thinking that through, and then you forget that you've built up the habit, and then it's like it's being repressed unconsciously. But I think that you know, or at least you knew when you first did it. And so, you know, when you meet people who are acting in a twisted and peculiar way, and you ask yourself, they're very manipulative, say, you ask yourself, well, do they know what they're doing? The answer to that could be, well, no. But another answer could be, yeah, but they knew once. They knew when they made the decision to start acting like that, but after they did it 100 times or so and made it into an automatic routine, well, then they forgot its origin, and now it runs autonomously. And so now they don't know, but they did know. And so, you know, this is the sort of point, and this is the real point of the existentialists, where clinical psychology and the claims of morality start to become very tightly aligned. And it's something that the psychiatric and psychological industries, so to speak, don't really tackle head on. My experience has been that in these situations, for example, where the person has 5 terrible things going on in their life, that there's just deception twisted in and strewn in all of that. People are betraying each other, and there's no fidelity in the relationships, there's no clear and genuine communication, everything's manipulation, no one admits to what they're really up to. You know, there's a lot of false and saccharine love, which has absolutely nothing to do with love. It's all for appearance, you know, and you cannot be healthy in a situation like that. I don't think, in my experience, you know, apart from terrible luck, because, you know, you can get cancer, diabetes, or any number of awful things. In my experience, apart from the tragedies of life, there is nothing that hurts people more than deception. Lies do people in. And that's an existentialist claim. The claim is, first, well, life is basically unbearable. That's an existential claim. And then there's the hope that with sufficient caution and attention and clarity of thought and speech, you can master it. You can master it to the point where you can even accept the fact that it's tragic. But if you multiply its tragedy with the use of deceit, it's like, forget it. Because, you know, it's one thing to be hurt. You know, maybe you break your leg. That's one thing. It's another thing to be attacked by 2 or 3 people who break your leg and do everything they can to demean you at the same time. It's like, lots of people break their leg and they're not traumatized. It's very few people who can go through the latter experience without being, you know, seriously and permanently damaged. Here's Pascal, one of the first existentialists. When I consider the brief span of my life swallowed up in the eternity before and behind it, the small space that I fill, or even see, engulfed in the infinite immensity of spaces which I know not, and which know not me, I am afraid, and I wonder to see myself here rather than there. For there's no reason why I should be here rather than there, or now rather than then. Now, another thing the existentialists do that's very, they're romantics. They're not Enlightenment rationalists, and part of the reason they're romantics is because they actually don't believe that life is rational. And Pascal's comment on what the existentialists often call thrownness is a description of the fundamental irrationality of life. It's like, okay, here you are. Well, why you? Why here? Why now? Why the way you look? Why with your family? Why your gender? Well, there's no answer to any of those questions. It's just, how it is. It's blind and random chance, maybe. There's this, but even if it's not that, there's something arbitrary about it. And there's something that's arbitrary and not self-evidently just or fair. You know, because maybe you could have been born, you know, there are people around the world who make their living in garbage heaps, right? So there's whole families and whole societies that live out in the garbage dumps, and all they do is pick out, you know, the metal and glass that will enable them to sort of glean out a living. It's like, well, why the hell aren't you born there instead of, you know, sitting right here? So there's an irrational element to that, right? You can't justify it, you can't explain it, and you don't really even know what to do about it, right? I mean, do you owe an existential debt to the people who were born much worse off than you, or is it just okay that it's that way? Well, it's a problem. That, by the way, is the problem the existentialists call thrownness, which is you're arbitrarily here in that form, and there's no explanation for it. And it's something that's outside of human concepts of, say, justice and equity and fairness and even sensibility. And then Pascal also points to the fact that, well, we're rather localized things. You know, you're right there, and there's a lot of what isn't right there around you. So you're a small thing against a big, infinitely large potential span of experience, and that's also an existential challenge. It's the challenge of the finite against the infinite. And that's also an existential problem, which is that it isn't your problem, or it is. It's more a problem. It's just a problem that springs out of being human. One of the places where existentialism and phenomenology touch, the phenomenologists, of course, make the case that reality is best conceived of as the totality of your experience, even if that includes things that you wouldn't normally consider you. But certainly it includes things like emotions and motivations and bodily sensations and all the things that aren't precisely rational. The existentialists would take that claim and push it a bit farther by saying, and this is analogous to something I already told you, that the degree to which that phenomenological field, your field of experience, is fractured and incoherent and paradoxical, that occurs in precise proportion to the weakening of the spirit within you that necessarily has to be strong in order to remain uncorrupted by the tragic conditions of existence. So along with the existentialist claim, which is that life is unbearable in its very nature, it's tragic and unbearable in its very nature, is the idea that that's made worse by your own set of inadequacies that you could repair, and worse, that to the degree that you are rife with inadequacies that you could repair, you're going to make the tragic situation that's integral to life worse. Again, not only for yourself, but also for other people.